Undercover CEO saw black waitress with a neck brace in his cafe. What he discovered shocked him. The rain drummed against the windows of Coffee and Dreams as Daniel Cross pushed through the glass door, the familiar chime announcing another customer's arrival. But today, he wasn't the CEO of Cross Corp Industries, he was just Dan, a middle-aged man in worn jeans and a faded baseball cap, seeking shelter from the storm. Daniel had built his coffee empire from the ground up, starting with a single cart 15 years ago. Now, with over 200 locations across the country, he rarely visited the individual cafes anymore. Board meetings, investor calls, and quarterly reports had replaced the simple joy of watching customers savor their first sip of perfectly brewed coffee. That's why he'd started these undercover visits, to see what his empire really looked like from the customer's perspective. The familiar aroma of roasted beans and fresh pastries should have comforted him, but something felt off. The usual warm buzz of conversation was muted, replaced by an undercurrent of tension he couldn't quite place. Staff members moved with hurried efficiency, their smiles seeming forced rather than genuine. "Welcome to Coffee and Dreams. I'll be right with you," called a voice from behind the counter. Daniel looked up to see a young black woman in her early 20s, her name tag reading, Tasha. What immediately caught his attention wasn't her bright smile or professional demeanor, it was the white cervical collar wrapped around her neck, stark against her dark skin and burgundy uniform. He watched, fascinated and concerned, as Tasha carefully lifted a tray loaded with steaming mugs and plates. The weight of the tray made her wince slightly, and she paused for just a moment, her free hand instinctively reaching toward her neck before she caught herself and continued toward a corner table. "Careful there, honey," an elderly woman at table 3 called out. "You shouldn't be carrying heavy things with that neck brace." Tasha's laugh was bright but brittle. "Oh, this old thing? It's nothing, really. I'm perfectly fine." She set down the orders with practiced precision, though Daniel noticed how she moved her entire torso rather than turning her head, keeping her neck rigid and protected. As she walked back toward the counter, Daniel observed her gait, measured, cautious, like someone navigating around invisible obstacles. When she thought no one was looking, her cheerful mask slipped just enough to reveal something deeper in her dark eyes. Pain, yes, but something else too. Something that looked suspiciously like fear. "What can I get started for you today?" Tasha asked, having made her way to where Daniel stood at the counter. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched in the fine lines around her eyes, the way she held her shoulders just a little too stiffly. "Just a large black coffee, please," Daniel replied, studying her face. "And maybe you could recommend something to eat. I'm new around here. The blueberry muffins are really good," she said, already reaching for a cup. "Fresh out of the oven this morning." Her movements were efficient but careful, each action deliberately controlled. As she prepared his coffee, Daniel found himself drawn into conversation. "That's quite a crowd you're handling today. Must be tiring work." Tasha's hand paused for just a fraction of a second before continuing to pump the coffee. "It keeps me busy," she said diplomatically. "I like staying active. Even with..." Daniel gestured vaguely toward his own neck, letting the question hang in the air. The change in Tasha's demeanor was immediate and subtle, a tightening around her eyes, a barely perceptible straightening of her already rigid posture. "Like I said, it's nothing serious. Just keeping me on my toes." She handed him his coffee with that same practiced smile, but her eyes had gone cautious, almost guarded. Daniel took a seat at a small table near the window, positioning himself where he could observe the flow of the cafe without being obvious about it. Over the next hour, he watched Tasha work with a mixture of admiration and growing concern. She was clearly an excellent employee, attentive to customers, quick with orders, always maintaining that professional cheerfulness even when dealing with difficult patrons. But there was something almost heroic about the way she pushed through what was obviously significant discomfort. Every time she lifted a tray, every time she reached for something on a high shelf, every time she bent to clean a table, he could see her fighting against her body's protests. Around noon, the lunch rush began in earnest, and the cafe filled with office workers and students seeking their midday caffeine fix. Daniel watched as the pace intensified, orders flying across the counter, the espresso machine hissing almost constantly. Through it all, Tasha maintained her rhythm, though he noticed she'd started taking slightly longer pauses between tasks, her hand drifting to her neck when she thought no one was watching. "Tasha, table 7 needs clearing," called out a coworker from behind the counter. "On it," Tasha replied, grabbing a bus tub. Daniel winced as he watched her load it with heavy ceramic mugs and plates, the weight clearly straining her injured neck. She made 3 trips instead of her usual efficient 2, though she tried to make it look casual rather than necessary. It was during one of these trips that Daniel overheard a snippet of conversation between 2 other employees. "I still can't believe she's back so soon," whispered a young man with bleached hair, glancing toward Tasha. "Shh," his companion hissed. "You know we're not supposed to talk about it." "But 3 weeks? For what happened in the—" "Stop." The second employee, an older woman with graying temples, shot him a warning look. "Not here." The conversation died abruptly as Tasha returned to the counter area, but Daniel filed away every word. 3 weeks. Something that happened somewhere they couldn't discuss openly. His business instincts, honed by years of corporate investigation and problem-solving, began to sharpen. As the afternoon wore on, Daniel noticed something else that troubled him. Every time a particular man in an expensive suit entered from what appeared to be the office area behind the counter, the entire staff seemed to tense up. The man was tall, probably in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that spoke of authority. When his eyes swept the cafe floor, conversations quieted, and employees suddenly became very focused on their tasks. But it was Tasha's reaction that concerned Daniel the most. The moment this man, whose name tag identified him as R. Carlisle, regional manager, appeared, Tasha's careful composure became almost brittle. Her movements, already cautious due to her injury, became even more controlled, more deliberate. She avoided making eye contact with Carlisle, keeping her head down and her focus laser-sharp on whatever task was immediately in front of her. Daniel watched as Carlisle surveyed the cafe like a general inspecting troops. His gaze lingered on Tasha for several long seconds, and Daniel could swear he saw something predatory in the man's expression. Not that, something else. Something calculating and cold. When Carlisle's attention finally moved on, Tasha's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly with relief. It was such a small gesture that most people would have missed it entirely, but Daniel had spent years learning to read people, to pick up on the subtle signals that revealed what words couldn't say. As the late afternoon sun began to slant through the cafe windows, painting everything in golden hues, Daniel finished his 3rd cup of coffee and prepared to leave. But as he stood to go, he caught Tasha's eye one more time. "Thank you for the recommendation," he said, indicating his empty plate where a blueberry muffin had been. "You were right, it was delicious." For just a moment, her professional mask slipped, and he saw something genuine in her expression. Gratitude, maybe, for a simple kindness in what was clearly a difficult day. "I'm glad you enjoyed it," she said softly. "Will we see you again?" There was something almost hopeful in the question, as if his presence, that of a stranger who had treated her with basic human decency, had been a bright spot in an otherwise challenging shift. "I think you will," Daniel replied, and meant it. As he stepped back out into the now gentle evening rain, Daniel Cross found himself thinking not about quarterly reports or market expansion, but about a young woman with pain in her eyes and a neck brace that told a story he was determined to understand. Something was very wrong in his cafe, and he was going to find out what. 2 days later, Daniel returned to Coffee and Dreams, this time wearing a different baseball cap and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. He'd spent the previous evening researching everything he could about workplace injuries in the food service industry, and what he'd learned made his stomach turn. Too many accidents, too many cover-ups, too many employees afraid to speak up for fear of losing their jobs. Tasha was working the morning shift again, her neck brace as prominent as before. Daniel noticed she moved even more carefully today, as if the pain had worsened rather than improved. He ordered the same black coffee and chose a seat with a clear view of the counter, pretending to read a newspaper while keeping one eye on the staff dynamics. "Morning, Tasha," he said when she brought his coffee over. "How are you feeling today?" She paused, coffee pot still in hand, and for a moment her professional smile wavered. "Oh, you know. Some days are better than others." She started to turn away, but Daniel's next question stopped her cold. "That neck injury looks pretty serious. Car accident?" The change in her expression was immediate and telling. Her eyes widened slightly, and she glanced quickly around the cafe before sitting down across from him, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "Yes," she said quickly, too quickly. "Just a silly car accident. Rear-ended at a red light about 3 weeks ago. Nothing major, really. The other driver's insurance is handling everything." But even as she spoke, her eyes darted nervously toward the back office area where Carlyle had emerged from yesterday. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her apron, and Daniel noticed how she seemed to be reciting the words rather than remembering an actual event. "That's terrible," Daniel said gently. "Those whiplash injuries can be tricky. Did it happen on your way to work or—" "Actually, I should get back," Tasha interrupted, standing abruptly. "The lunch rush starts early on Wednesdays." She hurried away before he could ask another question, leaving Daniel with the distinct impression that he'd struck a nerve. For the next hour, Daniel nursed his coffee and observed. Around 11:30, 2 employees took their break at a table near his, apparently unaware that their conversation was carrying. "I still feel terrible about what happened to Tasha," said a young woman with purple streaks in her hair. Her name tag read Maya. "Ship," warned her companion, a middle-aged man named Rick according to his badge. "You know we're not supposed to talk about it. But it's been 3 weeks, Rick. That stack of boxes in the back room was way too high. I told Carlyle it was dangerous, but he said we needed to maximize storage space." Daniel's grip tightened on his coffee cup. "Boxes in the back room. Not a car accident." "Maya, please," Rick whispered urgently. "You know what happened to Jennifer when she tried to file that safety report last month? She's still looking for work. It's not fair," Maya continued, her voice breaking slightly. "Tasha could have been finished when those supplies collapsed on her. And now she's back here pretending it was a car accident because she's terrified of losing her job." Rick glanced around nervously. "Look, I feel bad too, but there's nothing we can do. Carlyle made it clear, anyone who talks about workplace incidents will be terminated immediately. And you know he's got connections all over the district. He can make sure we never work in food service again." Daniel felt his blood pressure rising. A workplace injury, covered up and blamed on a fictional car accident. His employee was walking around in pain, terrified to tell the truth about what had happened in his own establishment. "Besides," Rick added grimly, "it's not just here. My buddy Mark works at the Coffee and Dreams over on 5th Street. He says the same thing happened there 2 months ago. Unsafe storage, employee got hurt, management blamed it on something else. It's like they have a playbook for this stuff." Maya shook her head in disgust. "Sometimes I think about calling corporate, but what's the point? They're probably in on it too." If only you knew, Daniel thought grimly, that corporate was sitting 10 feet away and learning about this for the first time. The 2 employees finished their break and returned to work, leaving Daniel to process what he just heard. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was a pattern. A systematic approach to covering up safety violations and workplace injuries. And somewhere in his company's middle management structure, people like Carlyle were not only allowing it to happen but actively orchestrating it. As if summoned by Daniel's thoughts, Carlyle emerged from the back office, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the busy morning rush. Daniel watched as the man's eyes swept the cafe with that same predatory assessment he'd noticed before. When his gaze landed on Tasha, who was restocking napkin dispensers near the window, his expression hardened. Carlyle approached her with the measured steps of someone who enjoyed having power over others. Daniel couldn't hear what he said, but he could see Tasha's body language, the way she tensed up, the slight tremor in her hands as she continued her task, the way she nodded quickly without ever making eye contact. Whatever Carlyle whispered to her, it wasn't friendly encouragement. When he finished speaking, he placed a hand on Tasha's shoulder, not in comfort, but in a way that made her freeze completely. The gesture lasted only a few seconds, but its meaning was clear, a reminder of who held the power in this relationship. After Carlyle returned to his office, Tasha remained motionless for several long moments, staring out the window as if trying to compose herself. When she finally continued her work, Daniel noticed her hands were shaking slightly. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, and the picture they formed made Daniel sick to his stomach. A workplace injury covered up as a car accident. Employees threatened into silence. A pattern of similar incidents at other locations. And in the middle of it all, a young woman too afraid to tell the truth about what had happened to her in the backroom of his own cafe. Daniel folded his newspaper and stood to leave, his mind already working on his next move. He needed more information, more evidence, and most importantly, he needed to find a way to get Tasha to trust him enough to tell him the truth. As he walked toward the door, he caught Tasha's eye one more time. The fear he saw there was like a punch to the gut, fear of a young woman who had been hurt on the job and then made to feel like speaking the truth would cost her everything. He was going to make sure that changed. Soon. Daniel knew he needed a different approach. Sitting in cafes and eavesdropping would only get him so far. He needed Tasha to trust him, to see him as someone safe enough to confide in. So the next morning, he transformed himself once again, this time into someone who might understand what it felt like to be on the bottom rung of the employment ladder. He arrived at Coffee and Dreams wearing paint-stained work boots, faded jeans with a small tear at the knee, and a worn t-shirt advertising a local hardware store. A tool belt hung loosely around his waist, and he deliberately mussed his hair to look like someone who'd been doing manual labor. To anyone watching, he was just another working-class guy grabbing coffee before heading to a job site. The morning rush was winding down when he approached the counter. Tasha looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she hadn't been sleeping well. The neck brace seemed to be bothering her more today. He noticed how she kept trying to adjust it, her fingers tugging at the Velcro straps. "The usual?" she asked, recognizing him despite his different appearance. "You bet. And maybe one of those breakfast sandwiches too. Been working since 6 this morning, and my stomach's starting to complain." As she prepared his order, Daniel launched into his carefully crafted persona. "You know, I've been doing handyman work around the city for about 15 years now. Seen a lot of workplaces, and I gotta say, this place seems like one of the better ones. Good atmosphere, friendly staff." Tasha glanced up at him, something flickering in her eyes. "It has its moments," she said carefully. "Though I did notice your boss, that silver-haired fellow, he seems pretty intense. Reminds me of some of the contractors I've worked for. The type who like to keep a tight ship, if you know what I mean." "Mr. Carlyle?" Tasha said quietly, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Yeah, he runs things pretty strictly around here." Daniel leaned against the counter, adopting the casual pose of someone making small talk during a slow moment. "You seem like you've got a good head on your shoulders. Probably been working service industry for a while?" 3 years here," she replied, then added with something that sounded almost like pride. "Never missed a shift until—" She gestured vaguely at her neck brace, then caught herself. "That car accident you mentioned? Man, those can really mess you up. I had a buddy who got rear-ended last year, still dealing with the insurance company." Tasha's expression became guarded again. "Yeah, it's been complicated." Daniel sensed an opening. "You know, in my line of work, I've learned to be pretty careful around certain types of managers. Some of them, they don't like when workers ask too many questions or speak up about things. They prefer everyone to keep their heads down and just do the job." For a moment, Tasha's professional mask slipped entirely. She looked directly at him, and Daniel saw a flash of recognition in her eyes, the look of someone who had found an unexpected ally. "Be careful around Mr. Carlyle," she whispered urgently, glancing toward the back office. He doesn't like people who ask questions or people who might cause trouble. Just keep your head down if you ever have to deal with him, okay? Before Daniel could respond, Tasha quickly busied herself with wiping down the already clean counter, effectively ending the conversation. But her warning hung in the air between them, loaded with more meaning than her words alone conveyed. Daniel took his breakfast to a corner table, positioning himself where he could observe but remain unobtrusive. Around noon, Tasha took what appeared to be her lunch break, stepping out the back door that led to a small employee area behind the building. Daniel waited a few minutes, then followed, ostensibly heading to his truck parked in the adjacent lot. What he saw made his blood run cold. Tasha was sitting on a concrete loading dock, her head in her hands, shoulders shaking with barely suppressed sobs. She had removed her neck brace temporarily, and Daniel could see the full extent of the bruising that extended down from her neck, dark purple and yellow marks that spoke of serious trauma. But before he could approach her, the back door slammed open and Carlyle emerged, his face twisted with anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Carlyle snarled, his voice low but venomous. "I told you that thing stays on during work hours. What if a customer sees you? What if someone starts asking questions?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Carlyle," Tasha whispered, fumbling to put the brace back on. "It was just hurting so bad, and I thought on my break." "You don't think?" Carlyle interrupted, moving closer to tower over her. "That's not what I pay you for. I pay you to do your job and keep your mouth shut about things that are none of your business." Daniel pressed himself against his truck, staying hidden but close enough to hear every word. "Now listen to me very carefully," Carlyle continued, his voice taking on a sinister quality. "I've been more than generous letting you come back to work so soon after your little accident. But my patience has limits. You keep wearing that brace, you keep telling people it was a car crash, and you keep your mouth shut about anything else. Because if I hear even a whisper that you've been talking about things you shouldn't be talking about, I'll cut your hours so fast it'll make your head spin. And after that, well, accidents happen to people who don't know when to keep quiet." The threat was barely veiled, and Daniel saw Tasha shrink back as if she'd been physically struck. "I understand, Mr. Carlyle," she whispered. "Good. Now get back in there and do your job. And remember, I've got eyes and ears everywhere in this district. Step out of line even once, and you'll never work in food service again." Carlyle stalked back inside, leaving Tasha alone on the loading dock. Daniel watched as she sat there for several more minutes, trying to compose herself before returning to work. When she finally stood and walked back toward the door, her movements were those of someone carrying an invisible weight on her shoulders. As Daniel drove away that afternoon, one thing was crystal clear: this wasn't just about covering up a workplace injury. This was about systematic intimidation, about using fear to keep employees silent about dangerous conditions. And Tasha wasn't just a victim of a workplace accident, she was being terrorized into complicity by the very person who should have been ensuring her safety. The game was about to change. Daniel spent the next 3 days methodically visiting every Coffee and Dreams location within a 50-mile radius, each time adopting his working-class handyman persona. His tool belt and paint-stained clothes had become his uniform for uncovering the truth about what was happening in his own company. What he discovered made him question everything he thought he knew about the business he'd built from the ground up. At the downtown location on 5th Street, he struck up a conversation with a barista named Marcus during the afternoon lull. The young man had been working there for 2 years and seemed eager to talk to someone who understood the struggles of blue-collar work. "You ever notice how some managers just have it out for the regular workers?" Daniel asked, stirring sugar into his coffee with deliberate casualness. Marcus glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "Man, you don't even know. Our regional manager here, this guy Peterson, he's just like the one at the other locations. They all went to some kind of management training together, and now they run these places like military camps." "What do you mean?" "Equipment breaks down, they tell us to keep using it anyway. Storage areas become death traps because they cram too much stuff in too small spaces. And God forbid you get hurt on the job." Marcus shook his head bitterly. 3 months ago, our shift supervisor Sarah slipped on a wet floor in the back room. Messed up her knee pretty bad. You know what Peterson told her? Daniel waited, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Said it happened because she was careless, and if she filed a workers' comp claim, she'd be looking for a new job. Told her to say she fell at home and that the company insurance would help out with her medical bills as a goodwill gesture. Marcus air-quoted the words with obvious disgust. Sarah's got 2 kids and can't afford to lose this job. So she went along with it. Where's Sarah now? Still here, but limping around pretending everything's fine. Peterson keeps her on just enough hours that she can't qualify for benefits, but not so few that she can claim unemployment. Marcus's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I heard from my cousin who works at the mall location that the same thing happened there. And the one over on Cherry Street. It's like they have a whole system worked out. Daniel's jaw tightened. A system. That's exactly what this was, a coordinated effort to suppress workplace injuries and avoid liability across multiple locations. Over the next 2 days, he visited 4 more cafes, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. At each location, employees whispered similar stories when they thought no one important was listening. Equipment that should have been replaced months ago. Safety protocols that existed only on paper. Regional managers who ruled through intimidation and fear. At the Riverside location, he met Elena, a middle-aged woman who had been with the company for 5 years. She told him about the industrial coffee grinder that had been making weird noises for months, before it finally malfunctioned and caught her hand. Her fingers were still bandaged, but according to her manager, she had injured herself at home doing yard work. They paid for the hospital visit in cash. Elena explained, her voice hollow with resignation. Made me sign something saying I wouldn't pursue any other compensation. I was so scared of losing my job that I just went along with it. My husband's been out of work for 8 months, and we can't afford for me to be unemployed too. At the college campus location, Daniel learned about Jamie, a student who had suffered a concussion when a poorly secured shelf unit fell on him in the stockroom. The manager there had driven him to a clinic 40 minutes away, far from the local hospital where questions might be asked, and paid for his treatment with a company credit card. The crazy thing is, confided Jamie's coworker, a young woman named Ashley. Jamie doesn't even remember signing the paperwork they showed him later. He had a concussion, for crying out loud. But apparently he agreed that he had been goofing around and caused the accident himself. By the end of the week, Daniel had documented similar incidents at 7 different locations. The regional managers all seemed to be operating from the same playbook: deny, deflect, intimidate, and pay just enough to keep victims quiet without admitting liability. But the most chilling revelation came from his visit to the newest location, where he overheard 2 managers discussing their quarterly safety metrics. Corporate's been asking fewer questions about our incident reports lately, one said with obvious satisfaction. Ever since we started the new protocols, our official injury rate has dropped by 90%. Yeah, Peterson was smart to suggest the off-site treatment approach. Keeps everything off the books, and the small cash payouts are way cheaper than workers' comp claims. Daniel realized with growing horror that this wasn't just middle management gone rogue. It was a coordinated strategy that someone higher up the chain had either approved or willfully ignored. His quarterly reports had shown decreasing workplace incident rates across all regions, and he had celebrated what he thought was improved safety training and better equipment maintenance. Instead, it had been a systematic cover-up that left his employees vulnerable and afraid. That evening, Daniel sat in his home office surrounded by notes from his undercover visits. Names, dates, incidents, witnesses, a pattern of corruption that extended far beyond what had happened to Tasha. His employees were being hurt, threatened, and silenced, all while he sat in board meetings congratulating himself on his company's improved safety record. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. These weren't just statistics or liability issues. They were real people with real injuries who had been failed by the very company he had built to provide opportunities and stability. Tomorrow, he would return to the original cafe where this had all started. It was time to get Tasha to trust him completely, because what he was planning would require her courage as much as his authority. The truth was going to come out, and heads were going to roll. Daniel arrived at the original Coffee and Dreams location early Friday morning, his handyman disguise now feeling like a second skin. But today was different. Today, he carried a small digital recorder in his tool belt and a fire in his chest that had been building for a week. He had seen enough, heard enough, and documented enough to know that what was happening here was not just wrong, it was criminal. The morning rush was particularly brutal. A line of customers stretched nearly to the door, the espresso machine was running at full capacity, and the staff was clearly overwhelmed. In the middle of it all, Tasha moved with that same careful determination he'd observed before, but Daniel could see she was reaching her limits. Her neck brace had shifted slightly, revealing more of the bruising that extended down toward her collarbone. Every time she lifted a tray or reached for something on a high shelf, her face would tighten with pain that she was clearly trying to hide. But it was more than just physical discomfort. There was an exhaustion in her movements that spoke of someone who had been fighting too hard for too long. Daniel ordered his usual coffee and found a strategic seat near the pickup counter where he could observe without being obvious. The cafe was understaffed for the Friday morning crowd, and he watched as the pressure built with each new customer, each complicated order, each impatient sigh from people checking their watches. "Tasha, we need 3 more lattes for table 12, called Maya from behind the register, stress evident in her voice. "Coming right up," Tasha replied, but Daniel noticed how she had to pause and steady herself against the counter before beginning the order. Her hands were trembling slightly, whether from pain, exhaustion, or stress he couldn't tell. Probably all 3. It was just past 10:30 when everything fell apart. Tasha was carrying a fully loaded tray, 6 ceramic mugs filled with steaming coffee, 2 plates stacked with pastries, silverware carefully balanced on the side, when her strength simply gave out. Daniel watched in horror as her legs buckled, the weight of the tray combining with her neck injury to throw off her balance completely. The crash echoed through the cafe like a gunshot. Ceramics shattered against the tile floor, coffee splashed across tables and walls, and Tasha collapsed into the mess, her neck brace askew and her face contorted with pain. For a moment, the entire cafe fell silent. Customers stopped mid-conversation, baristas froze with milk steamers in their hands, and the only sound was Tasha's labored breathing as she struggled to sit up among the broken dishes and spilled coffee. Then Carlyle appeared, moving faster than Daniel had ever seen him move, but not toward Tasha to check if she was injured. Instead, he was scanning the cafe, his eyes calculating and cold, assessing how many customers had witnessed what just happened. "Maya, Rick, get her out of sight." "No," Carlyle hissed under his breath, just loud enough for Daniel to hear. "And someone clean this up immediately." "Mr. Carlyle, she's hurt," Maya protested, kneeling beside Tasha. "We should call an ambulance." "We're not calling anyone," Carlyle snapped, his voice low but venomous. "Get her to the back room. This is exactly the kind of drama I warned her about." Daniel stood up, every instinct screaming at him to intervene, but he forced himself to remain in character. Instead, he moved closer, ostensibly to help clean up the spill that had splashed near his table. "Miss, are you okay?" he asked Tasha, crouching down beside her. Up close, he could see tears of pain and frustration streaming down her face. "I'm fine," she whispered automatically, the lie so practiced it came out even though she was clearly anything but fine. "Just clumsy. I'm so sorry about the mess." "Don't apologize," Daniel said gently, helping her to her feet while Maya and Rick hovered uncertainly. "Accidents happen." "No, they don't," Carlyle interjected sharply, appearing beside them like a storm cloud. "Not to employees who follow proper safety procedures." The callousness of the statement, delivered while Tasha was still visibly shaking from pain and embarrassment, pushed Daniel to his limit. But before he could respond, Tasha spoke up. "Mr. Carlyle, please," she said, her voice breaking. "I tried to tell you the tray was too heavy with this neck injury, but you said—" "I said nothing," Carlyle cut her off, his eyes flashing dangerously. And if you know what's good for you, you'll remember that. That's when something inside Tasha finally snapped. Maybe it was the pain, maybe it was the humiliation of collapsing in front of a cafe full of customers, or maybe it was just the accumulated weight of weeks of fear and silence. But suddenly, she was no longer the compliant, terrified employee Carlyle had been bullying. "No," she said, her voice stronger than Daniel had ever heard it. "I won't remember that, because it's not true." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Daniel saw Carlyle's face go white with rage. "You're making a very big mistake," Carlyle said quietly, his voice carrying a threat that made several nearby customers shift uncomfortably. But Tasha was past caring about threats. Turning to Daniel, she looked directly into his eyes with a desperation that took his breath away. 3 weeks ago, I filed a safety complaint because the storage room was packed too high with supplies," she said, speaking quickly before she could lose her nerve. "Mr. Carlyle told me to mind my own business. 2 days later, those same boxes collapsed on me while I was getting inventory for the morning shift. The impact threw me against the concrete wall and injured my neck and back." "Tasha, shut up," Carlyle hissed, but she continued as if he hadn't spoken. "He told me that if I filed a workers' compensation claim, I'd be fired and blacklisted from every food service job in the city. He made me say it was a car accident. He's been threatening me every day since I came back to work, telling me to keep quiet or lose my job." Her voice broke on the last words, but she had said it. Finally, after weeks of silence and fear, she had told the truth to someone who might actually care enough to do something about it. Daniel looked at her face, at the relief mixed with terror, at the courage it had taken to finally speak up despite everything she had to lose, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. "Thank you for telling me," he said quietly. "And I promise you, this is going to change everything." The following Monday morning, Carlyle called an emergency staff meeting for all Coffee and Dreams employees in the district. Word had spread that something big was happening. Managers from 6 different locations had been summoned, along with every hourly employee who could make the 10 a.m. gathering at the main location. Tasha arrived early, her neck brace still prominent but her posture somehow different. Over the weekend, she had made peace with whatever consequences might come from speaking up. She had done the right thing, regardless of the cost, and that knowledge gave her a strength she hadn't felt in weeks. The cafe had been cleared of customers, chairs arranged in rows facing a small podium that had been set up near the counter. Regional managers clustered together near the front, Carlyle among them, his silver hair perfectly styled and his expression smugly confident. He had spent the weekend doing damage control, crafting explanations, and preparing to eliminate the problem employee, who had dared to break ranks. Maya squeezed Tasha's hand as they took seats in the middle section. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "you did the right thing." Rick nodded from the seat behind them. "We've got your back," he said quietly. Several other employees murmured similar sentiments. Word of Tasha's courage had spread through the unofficial network of workers, and many of them had decided that if she could be brave enough to speak up, maybe they could too. At exactly 10 o'clock, a man in an expensive suit walked to the podium. He was tall, well-built, with graying hair and the kind of confident bearing that spoke of someone accustomed to command. Most of the employees had never seen him before, though the regional managers seemed to recognize him and were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "Good morning, everyone," the man said, his voice carrying easily through the cafe. "I'm sure you're all wondering why you've been called here today." Carlyle leaned forward slightly, his expression expectant. He clearly assumed this was corporate's way of announcing new policies to prevent employees from speaking out of turn. "My name is Daniel Cross," the man continued, and Tasha felt her world tilt on its axis. "I'm the founder and CEO of Cross Corp Industries, which owns Coffee and Dreams." A collective gasp went through the assembled employees. Tasha's hand flew to her mouth as she stared at the man she had known as Dan, the down-on-his-luck handyman who had shown her kindness when she needed it most. Carlyle's face had gone ashen, and several other regional managers were looking around nervously, suddenly understanding that whatever they had expected from this meeting was not what they were about to get. For the past 2 weeks, Daniel continued, his voice growing harder, I have been visiting our locations undercover, posing as a customer and a worker. What I discovered has shaken me to my core. He pulled out a thick folder and set it on the podium. I have documented systematic safety violations, covered up workplace injuries, and intimidation tactics that have no place in any business, let alone one that bears my name. His eyes found Tasha in the crowd, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a warmth that was meant specifically for her. I have also witnessed extraordinary courage from employees who risked everything to tell the truth about what was happening in their workplace. Tasha felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in weeks, they were tears of relief rather than fear. Daniel's attention turned to Carlyle, and his expression became ice-cold. Mr. Carlyle, would you please stand up? Carlyle rose slowly, his arrogance crumbling as he realized his career was about to end very publicly. 3 weeks ago, you ignored a safety complaint filed by Tasha Williams about dangerously stacked inventory in the storage room. 2 days later, when that inventory collapsed and seriously injured Ms. Williams, you covered it up. You threatened her job if she filed a workers' compensation claim. You forced her to lie about the cause of her injuries. And you have been intimidating her every day since, using fear to ensure her silence. Carlyle opened his mouth to speak, but Daniel held up a hand. I have recordings of your threats. I have witness statements. I have medical records that clearly show Ms. Williams' injuries are consistent with the workplace accident she originally reported, not the fictional car crash you forced her to claim. Daniel's voice rose slightly, carrying to every corner of the cafe. Mr. Carlyle, you are terminated immediately. Security will escort you from the premises, and you will be hearing from our legal department regarding both civil and criminal charges. 2 security guards who had been waiting near the entrance stepped forward. Carlyle's face cycled through rage, disbelief, and finally resignation as he was led away without a word. But Daniel wasn't finished. This pattern of abuse extended beyond Mr. Carlyle to multiple locations and other regional managers. Effective immediately, 4 other regional managers in this district are also terminated. He called out their names one by one, and each was escorted out by security, leaving the remaining employees stunned by the swift justice being delivered. No, Daniel said, his voice becoming warmer as he addressed the hourly employees. Let's talk about making things right. He looked directly at Tasha. Ms. Williams, I am offering you immediate promotion to Regional Safety Coordinator, with full authority to inspect all locations and implement new safety protocols. Your medical expenses will be covered completely, you will receive full back pay for the time you've been working injured, and you will never have to fear retaliation for speaking up again. Tasha stood on shaking legs, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. Thank you, she whispered, then louder. Thank you. Additionally, Daniel continued, any employee who has been intimidated into silence about workplace injuries will receive full support to file proper claims. We will be conducting individual interviews with every team member to ensure everyone's safety concerns are heard and addressed. He paused, looking around the room at faces that showed everything from shock to relief to cautious hope. I built this company to provide good jobs and opportunities for growth. What I discovered these past 2 weeks is unacceptable, and it stops today. Anyone who puts profits ahead of people's safety has no place in this organization. As the meeting dispersed, employees clustering around Tasha to congratulate her, Daniel reflected on how a chance encounter with a young woman in a neck brace had revealed rot at the heart of his company. But more than that, it had shown him the extraordinary courage of ordinary people who simply wanted to be treated with dignity and respect. Tasha approached him as the cafe emptied, her eyes still bright with unshed tears. I can't believe you were the CEO this whole time, she said. I can't believe how brave you were, Daniel replied. You saved more than just yourself by speaking up. You saved everyone who comes after you. As Tasha smiled, the first genuine, unguarded smile he had seen from her, Daniel knew that rebuilding trust would take time. But watching her stand straighter, the fear finally gone from her eyes, he was certain they were on the right path. Sometimes the most important discoveries came from simply paying attention to the people who made everything possible.